By late July 1942, the German war machine seemed unstoppable on the southern front of the Soviet Union. The panzer divisions of the Sixth Army tore through the Russian steppe, kicking up dust clouds visible for miles, their sights fixed on a single industrial jewel on the banks of the Volga River. German commanders peered through their binoculars and saw a city that appeared ripe for the taking, a metropolis of factories and depots that bore the name of the Soviet leader himself. Yet the true danger to Stalingrad was not just the tanks approaching its western suburbs, but the terrifying silence falling over the railway lines that fed it. The city was starving for ammunition before the battle for the city center even began, because every major supply artery connecting it to the industrial heartland had been effectively severed. In this war, battles were won not just by bullets and bravery, but by the relentless, unyielding logistics that kept an army breathing. Now, let us return to the scorching heat of the southern Russian steppe in the summer of 1942. The situation facing the Red Army was catastrophic. Following the failed Soviet offensives earlier in the year, Hitler launched Case Blue, a massive strategic drive intended to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus and cut off the Volga waterway. As the Wehrmacht surged forward, they did not just capture territory, they dismantled the infrastructure that held the Soviet Union together. The Soviet rail network, a vast web of steel that was the lifeblood of the Red Army, was designed primarily to radiate outward from Moscow. However, the lateral lines, the ones running north to south along the front, were few and fragile. As the Germans pushed toward the Great Bend of the Don River, they overran the critical rail junctions that supplied Stalingrad from the west and the north. The crucial line running from Gryazny to Stalingrad was cut. The connection to the breadbasket of the Kuban in the south was severed. Day by day, the station masters in Stalingrad watched their telegraph lines go dead, one after another. The vast marshalling yards, usually a cacophony of shunting locomotives and shouting porters, began to grow quiet. The profound silence was broken only by the wail of air raid sirens. The Luftwaffe, under the command of Wolfram von Richthofen, had established total air superiority over the steppe. His Stuka dive bombers and Heinkel level bombers roamed the skies with impunity, hunting not just troop concentrations, but the trains themselves. Locomotives were strafed until they exploded in plumes of steam and twisted iron. Tracks were pulverized into craters, leaving supply trains stranded miles from the front. The German pilots understood the equation of modern war perfectly. If they destroyed the trains, the tanks waiting in Stalingrad would run dry of fuel, and the artillery batteries would fall silent for lack of shells. The aerial interdiction was so severe that moving supplies by day became a suicide mission. Soviet logistics officers scrambled to organize convoys under the cover of darkness, but the nights in the steppe were short in the summer, and the distances were vast. With the rail lines from the west and north cut, the Soviet High Command looked desperately to the Volga River itself. For centuries, the Volga had been the primary artery of commerce for the Russian interior, a massive waterway capable of moving millions of tons of cargo. But in 1942, the river had become a death trap. The Luftwaffe dropped thousands of magnetic mines into the murky waters, turning the riverbed into a hidden minefield. Oil tankers arriving from Baku were targeted relentlessly. When hit, they turned the river into a flowing torrent of fire, choking the air with thick, black smoke that could be seen from the command bunkers in the city. Ferries and barges, The only link between the city on the west bank and the safety of the east bank were picked off one by one. The river, once a lifeline, was becoming a graveyard. This logistical strangulation created a crisis of unimaginable proportions for the defenders. The 62nd Army, tasked with holding the city, required thousands of tons of supplies every single day just to maintain a baseline defense. They needed food for the soldiers, fodder for the horses, medical supplies for the wounded, and mountains of ammunition to feed the machine guns and artillery pieces. Yet the warehouses were emptying faster than they could be replenished. Reports reaching the Kremlin painted a grim picture. Regiments were rationing shells, tanks were being dug in as static pillboxes because they had no fuel to maneuver, and soldiers were scavenging for scraps. The roads offered no salvation. The unpaved tracks of the region, known as Gruntovye Dorogi, were treacherous. In the blistering heat of July and August, they were choked with blinding dust that destroyed engines and clogged filters. When the rains came, these same roads would turn into the infamous Rasputitsa, a glue-like mud that swallowed trucks whole and brought motorized transport to a complete standstill. Even in the best conditions, the Soviet truck fleet was insufficient to replace the capacity of a railway. A single train could carry the load of hundreds of trucks, and without the trains, the math simply did not work. Stalingrad was effectively an island on land, surrounded by a sea of enemies and hostile terrain. The German Sixth Army was essentially tightening a noose around the city's neck, waiting for the defenders to suffocate. The strategic planners in Berlin were confident. They knew the railway maps as well as the Soviets did. They knew that once the lines at Milarovo and Likaya fell, Stalingrad was cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union's industrial output. They believed that biology and physics would finish what their panzers had started. A city without food or bullets could not fight. In the Kremlin, the mood was tense. Stalin and his generals pored over the maps, tracing the thick red lines of the German advance and the thin black lines of the remaining railways. They realized that if Stalingrad fell, the Volga would be closed, and the oil from the Caucasus would be cut off from the factories in the north. The war would be lost. They needed a solution, but the geography was unforgiving. To the west of the Volga lay the enemy. To the east lay the barren, empty steppe. Hundreds of miles of nothingness, devoid of infrastructure, roads, or rails. It was a blank space on the map, a void where no heavy transport had ever gone. And yet, as the generals stared at that empty space, they realized it was the only place left where the Germans were not. In the stifling heat of the Kremlin's map rooms, the Soviet State Defense Committee, known as the GKO, stared at the grim reality of the Eastern Front. The maps told a story of impending doom. With the western lines cut and the Volga River turning into a gauntlet of fire, the Soviet Union faced a logistical paradox. They had men and tanks in the north and oil in the south, but no way to bring them together at the critical pivot point of Stalingrad. The survival of the nation now hinged on a strip of barren earth on the east bank of the Volga, a region of ravines, salt marshes, and dust that had never seen a railway sleeper in history. The decision made in those frantic days of July 1942 was not born of careful strategic planning but of terrifying necessity. The GKO issued a decree that defied all engineering logic and peacetime standards. They ordered the construction of a new railway line, the Volzhskaya Rokada, or the Volga lateral. This line was to run parallel to the river on the safe eastern bank, connecting the transport hub of Saratov in the north to the approaches of Stalingrad in the south. It was a distance of nearly 1,000 kilometers when including the connecting spurs. In normal times, a project of this magnitude required years of geological surveys, embankment settling, and bridge construction. The GKO gave the engineers not years, but weeks. The order landed on the desks of the railway troops and engineers with the weight of a death sentence. The specifications were brutal in their simplicity. Build a functional, heavy-gauge railway capable of supporting massive military freight, and do it while the enemy was less than 100 miles away. The engineers looked at the proposed route and saw a nightmare. The terrain was not the flat, firm ground ideal for track laying. It was scarred by deep gullies and comprised of unstable soil that turned to powder in the summer and sludge in the autumn. There were no quarries for the millions of tons of granite ballast needed to stabilize the tracks. There were no timber forests nearby to harvest for the hundreds of thousands of sleepers required. Most critically, there was no time for blueprints. The luxury of design then build was abandoned. The surveyors were ordered to walk ahead of the bulldozers, staking out the route only hours before the earth movers arrived. It was design while building, a chaotic methodology where mistakes had to be fixed on the fly and optimization was sacrificed for pure speed. The engineers knew that laying track on unsettled earth was a recipe for derailments. But the alternative, waiting for the ground to settle, meant the German Sixth Army would be eating dinner in the ruins of Stalingrad before the first train ever arrived. The psychological pressure on the leadership of the project was immense. They understood that this railway was the only contingency plan left. If the Volga froze early, or if the Luftwaffe completely closed the river traffic, this single track of steel would be the only umbilical cord connecting the Red Army in Stalingrad to the rest of the Soviet war effort. Failure was not a professional hazard. It was an act of treason. The chiefs of the railway troops, under the command of fervent loyalists and terrified technocrats, scrambled to assemble the necessary administration. They divided the route into sectors, creating a decentralized command structure that allowed work to proceed simultaneously at dozens of points along the line. The logistical requirements for the construction itself were staggering. To build a railway to supply the front, they first had to supply the builders. Trainloads of shovels, pickaxes, and wheelbarrows had to be found in a country where factories were being evacuated or destroyed. They needed to move entire work camps, field kitchens, and medical tents into the empty steppe. The GKO authorized the requisitioning of local resources with absolute authority. If a local collective farm had a tractor, it was now property of the railway project. If a village had a stockpile of timber for winter heating, it was now destined to become railway ties. The decree also established a ruthless timeline. The line had to be operational by autumn. The engineers did the math and realized they needed to lay track at a speed that had never been achieved in the history of Russian rail transport, and they had to do it without the heavy automated track-laying machines that were trapped behind enemy lines or destroyed in the retreat. They would have to rely on manual labor, brute human force applied to steel and stone. As the orders trickled down from Moscow to the field commanders on the steppe, the scope of the challenge became visible. This was not merely a construction project. It was a battle against geography and time. The engineers stood on the dry, cracked earth of the East Bank, looking across the wide expanse of the Volga toward the smoking horizon of the West. They could hear the distant rumble of artillery, a constant reminder of the deadline that was inching closer every hour. They realized that the German advance was moving faster than their construction schedule. To beat the panzers, they would have to rewrite the rules of engineering. They would have to build a railway out of nothing in the middle of nowhere with the enemy breathing down their necks. The paperwork was signed, the stamps were pressed, and the impossible became mandatory. The GKO had spoken. The rails would reach Stalingrad, or the Soviet Union would die. The decree from Moscow was written in ink, but the railway itself was written in sweat and blood. With the timeline set and the survival of Stalingrad hanging in the balance, the Soviet state turned to the only resource it had in abundance, its people. The engineers did not wait for heavy machinery, for there were no fleets of bulldozers or steam shovels coming to their aid. Instead, a massive motley army materialized on the barren steppe, an army not of soldiers, but of laborers. This was the Army of Shadows, a force of nearly 100,000 souls gathered from the margins of society and the depths of the prison system, tasked with moving mountains of earth with little more than their bare hands. The composition of this workforce was a grim reflection of the Soviet Union at total war. A significant portion came from the Gulag system. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, established the Volgolag, the Volga Railway Camp, specifically for this project. Trainloads of prisoners arrived at the desolate work sites, men stripped of their names and reduced to units of labor. They were political dissidents, petty criminals, and enemies of the people, now offered a brutal path to redemption through exhaustion. Under the watchful eyes of armed guards and the perimeter of barbed wire that moved along with the railhead, these prisoner brigades formed the backbone of the heavy excavation teams. They were thrown into the deepest ravines and the hardest soil, their daily rations tied directly to the cubic meters of earth they moved. Yet, the prisoners were not alone. Alongside the guarded columns of the condemned were thousands of civilians mobilized by local party committees. Since the vast majority of able-bodied men had already been drafted into the Red Army to fight at the front, this civilian workforce was composed almost entirely of women, teenagers, and the elderly. They came from the collective farms of the Saratov and Stalingrad oblasts, bringing with them their own shovels, pickaxes, and wheelbarrows. These were the mothers and sisters of the men fighting 100 miles to the west. They understood that every sleeper laid brought a shell closer to their sons' artillery pieces. The scene on the steppe was biblical in its scale and primitive in its execution. Observers described the construction site as a gigantic anthill stretching from the horizon to the horizon. Without excavators, the earthworks required for the railway embankment had to be built by hand. Tens of thousands of people formed human chains, passing wicker baskets and wooden barrows filled with soil up the steep slopes of the rising grade. The air was permanently thick with a choking yellow dust that coated the lungs and turned the workers into gray, ghostly figures. The physical toll was staggering. The norms set by the engineers required the movement of millions of cubic meters of soil. In the heat of the Russian summer, temperatures on the steppe soared, baking the ground into a substance as hard as concrete. Workers swung pickaxes until their hands bled, chipping away at the recalcitrant earth inch by inch. When the soil was too loose, it threatened to slide away. When it was too hard, it broke their tools. They worked in shifts that defied human endurance, often sleeping on the bare ground beside the tracks they were building, only to rise before dawn to begin again. The lack of technology forced the engineers to improvise with ancient methods. To compact the loose soil of the embankments, a job usually done by heavy steamrollers, the commanders ordered trampling marches. Hundreds of workers would link arms and march back and forth across the fresh earth for hours, using the weight of their bodies to pack the dirt down tight enough to support a train. It was a rhythmic, exhausting dance of desperation, a literal physical connection between the people and the infrastructure they were forging. Logistics for this shadow army were a nightmare of their own. Feeding and watering 100,000 people in a region with no water sources and no agriculture required a supply chain that rivaled that of a military division. Water had to be carted in from the Volga in barrels, often arriving warm and brackish. Food was simple: watery soup, black bread, and occasionally dried fish. Scurvy and dysentery stalked the camps, striking down those whose immune systems had collapsed under the strain of overwork. Yet the work did not stop. If a worker fell, another stepped into the line. The momentum of the project had a terrifying inertia. The fear of the German advance was a more potent motivator than any whip. Among the civilian brigades, a fierce, grim determination took hold. These women and teenagers were not working at gunpoint like the prisoners, but they were driven by an equally powerful force. They could hear the distant thunder of the front. They saw the refugees streaming east, telling horror stories of the German occupation. They knew that if this railway failed, their homes would be next. This shared existential threat created a strange, hardened camaraderie. They organized socialist competitions between brigades, racing to see who could clear a cutting or lay a section of ballast faster. They sang folk songs to keep the rhythm of the digging, their voices rising over the clink of metal on stone, a defiant chorus in the empty wilderness. There were no cameras to record their daily heroism. There were no newsreels showing the teenage girl carrying a load of rocks meant for a grown man, or the elderly farmer using his personal horse to drag timber ties into place. They were the invisible infrastructure of the war, the human capital spent to buy time for the Soviet Union. As the embankment slowly rose from the steppe, winding its way south like a scar on the earth, it stood as a monument to the sheer brute force of mobilization. They were building a path for the iron horses of the Red Army, but they were building it with muscle, bone, and sheer will. The tens of thousands of laborers had performed a miracle with the earth, carving a flat scar across the face of the steppe, but a railway embankment without steel is merely a road to nowhere. As the engineers looked at the graded soil stretching toward the horizon, they faced a shortage that terrified them more than the lack of bulldozers. They had no rails. The Soviet Union, once a titan of heavy industry, was suffering from a catastrophic anemia of raw materials. The German advance had already swallowed the Donbass region, the heart of the nation's coal and steel production. The blast furnaces that hadn't been captured were either destroyed or were currently dismantled on flatbed trucks, being evacuated to the Urals. The rolling mills that remained operational were entirely dedicated to the production of tank armor and artillery shells. In the summer of 1942, the Soviet Union was not rolling new railway tracks. The planners in Moscow did the math and realized they needed nearly 200,000 tons of metal to complete the Volga line. The warehouses were empty. The factories were silent. The only steel available in the Soviet Union was the steel that was already bolted to the ground elsewhere. The solution the GKO arrived at was as brutal as it was pragmatic. To save the front in the west, they would cannibalize the rear in the east. They turned their eyes thousands of kilometers away to Siberia and the Far East, to the unfinished sections of the Baikal-Amur main line, the BAM. The BAM was a prestige project, intended to open up the resource-rich wilderness of eastern Siberia. Miles of track had already been laid through the taiga at enormous human cost. Now, the order came to undo it all. It was a reversal of progress on a continental scale. Engineering teams were dispatched to the Far East, not to build, but to destroy. Under the midnight sun of the Siberian summer, work crews clawed the spikes out of the sleepers and lifted the heavy steel rails from the beds they had only recently settled into. They stripped the BAM lag of its iron skeleton. This was a logistical amputation. The Soviet Union was eating its own limbs to keep its heart beating. The scale of this transfer was immense. The rails, along with switches, semaphore signals, and even the spikes, were loaded onto flat cars for a journey of over 6,000 kilometers across the Eurasian landmass. They traveled along the Trans-Siberian Railway, a river of steel flowing west against the current of refugees and evacuated factories flowing east. These trains had absolute priority. Station masters at remote Siberian outposts watched as train after train of used, rusty rails rattled past, knowing that this scrap metal was the only thing standing between the Volga and total collapse. But the BAM rails alone were not enough. The voracious appetite of the Volga lateral demanded more. The engineers became scavengers. They scoured the rear areas of the front, identifying secondary lines, factory sidings, and shunting yards that could be deemed non-essential. If a factory had been evacuated, its rail spur was ripped up the next day. If a branch line saw fewer than 3 trains a week, it was condemned. They pulled up Tsarist-era rails that had been laid before the Revolution, brittle iron that had survived World War I and the Civil War. They collected captured German rails where they could find them, even though the profiles didn't match Soviet standards. When this patchwork collection of steel finally arrived on the dusty banks of the Volga, it presented a nightmare for the construction crews. A standard railway is built with uniformity. Every rail is the same weight, the same length, and the same alloy, ensuring a smooth ride for the heavy locomotives. The piles of steel dumped on the step were a chaotic mix of different eras and standards. There were heavy Type 1 rails meant for main lines mixed with lighter Type 2 and Type 3 rails meant for industrial sidings. There were rails manufactured in 1940 lying next to rails stamped with dates from the 1890s. Some were worn down by decades of friction. Others were brand new but bent from the rough transport. The track layers, many of whom had never built a railway before, had to assemble this jigsaw puzzle in the dirt. They faced the technical challenge of joining rails of different heights and widths. A mismatch of even a few millimeters at a joint could cause a catastrophic derailment when a fully loaded train hit it at speed. The blacksmiths and welders worked furiously, forging custom fish plates, the metal bars that bolt rails together, to bridge the gaps between incompatible sections. They used shims and improvised spacers, hammering metal wedges into the joints to force the lines level. It was a Frankenstein railway, a cobbling together of mismatched parts held together by desperation and brute force. The result was a track that looked jagged to the trained eye. It lacked the sleek, geometric perfection of a peacetime line. The rails undulated slightly over the uneven, hand-packed earth. The transitions between rail types were harsh, creating points of stress that would hammer the wheels of any train that passed over them. But it was continuous. It was a line of metal connecting point A to point B, and in war, geometry was a luxury they could not afford. The arrival of the first shipments of American Lend-Lease rails provided a glimmer of high-quality steel, but these were precious and few, reserved for the most critical bridges and curves where the stress would be highest. The vast majority of the line remained a graveyard of the Soviet rail network, a museum of recycled history bolted to fresh pine sleepers. As the track-laying machines were unavailable, the heavy lifting continued to be done by hand. Teams of men and women used massive iron tongs to lift the rails, chanting in unison to coordinate the heave, dropping the steel onto the wooden ties with a heavy, dull thud that echoed across the steppe. Spike drivers followed, swinging heavy mauls in a rhythm that became the heartbeat of the project. Clang, clang, clang. With every spike driven, the chaos of the scavenger hunt was beaten into order. The mismatched steel was forced into a gauge of 1,124 millimeters, the standard Russian width. It didn't matter where the steel came from, or how old it was, or how far it had traveled. Once it was spiked down to the Volga earth, it had only one purpose. It was no longer a Siberian spur or a factory siding. It was the road to Stalingrad. The artery was being stitched back together, piece by jagged piece. The construction of the Volga lateral was a race against time, but by August 1942, it had devolved into a brawl with the elements and the enemy. The geography of the steppe, which had initially seemed like a blank canvas, revealed its true hostile nature. The summer of 1942 was historically hot, with temperatures routinely soaring past 40 degrees Celsius in the shade, though on the open steppe there was no shade. The sun hammered down on the workers with a physical weight. The rails, sitting in the open, became searingly hot iron bars that would blister bare skin upon contact. Men and women wrapped their hands in rags just to touch the tools. The air shimmered with heat haze, distorting the horizon and turning the distant dust clouds of the front into mirages of doom. Water became the currency of life. With the local wells drying up and the Volga often miles away from the specific sector of track being laid, thirst was a constant companion. The water carts that trundled up and down the line were guarded as strictly as ammunition dumps. Workers drank warm, muddy water that tasted of the barrels it came in, sweating it out almost instantly as they swung their hammers. The dust was omnipresent. It ground into their pores, clogged their eyes, and coated the food. It was a misery of biblical proportions, yet the heat was merely a passive enemy. The active enemy arrived from the sky. German reconnaissance pilots, flying high-altitude sorties over the East Bank, initially dismissed the activity below as disorganized refugee movements. However, as the embankment became continuous and the glint of steel began to appear, the intelligence officers in the Luftwaffe realized exactly what was happening. The Soviets were building a lifeline. Wolfram von Richthofen, the commander of the German 4th Air Fleet, understood the strategic implication immediately. If that line connected, the siege of Stalingrad would be broken. He ordered his pilots to shift their focus from the city to the steppe. The construction site became a kill zone. The terrain offered absolutely no cover. The steppe was flat, featureless, and terrifyingly open. When the air raid sirens, often just an observer banging a suspended piece of rail, began to wail, there were no forests to run into, no basements to hide in. The workers could only throw themselves flat into the shallow ditches of the unfinished embankment or crawl underneath the rolling stock of the construction trains. The German pilots, flying the terrifying Ju-87 Stukas and the sleek Bf-109s, treated the rail line as a practice range. They came in low, their engines screaming, strafing the long lines of laborers with machine gun fire and dropping anti-personnel bombs among the tent cities. The carnage was horrific. A construction site is not a dispersed military unit. It is a concentration of people and equipment. A single strafing run could kill dozens of workers and destroy weeks of progress. The wooden sleepers, dry as tinder from the summer sun, caught fire easily, sending plumes of black smoke into the sky that served as beacons for the next wave of bombers. Locomotives pulling the flat cars of supplies were prime targets. When a boiler exploded, it scalded anyone nearby with superheated steam. The tracks themselves were twisted into pretzels of steel by the high explosives, forcing the weary crews to undo their work and start again. Yet, the reaction of the Soviet work crews defied the expectations of the German attackers. In a normal construction project, such attacks would have halted work indefinitely. Here, they merely paused it. As soon as the planes disappeared over the horizon, the survivors stood up, dusted themselves off, and picked up their shovels. They did not flee. They buried the dead in shallow graves beside the ballast and filled the bomb craters with fresh earth. The crater, once an obstacle, became part of the foundation. The psychological impact of the bombing was inverted. Instead of terrorizing the workers into submission, it enraged them. Every bomb dropped was a reminder of why they were digging. To mitigate the slaughter, the engineers shifted tactics. The construction effort went nocturnal. As the sun set and the German planes returned to their airfields, the steppe came alive. Under the light of the moon and dimmed lanterns, thousands of people worked in a hushed frenzy. The clang of metal on metal was muffled with rags. Orders were whispered. It was a ghostly operation, a railway being built by phantoms in the dark. They laid track by feel, gauging the gauge width with their hands, driving spikes into the gloom. The cool of the night offered relief from the heat, but the darkness brought the danger of accidents, of crushed limbs and derailments on the uneven, unseen ground. The Red Army also began to prioritize the defense of the line. Anti-aircraft batteries, desperately needed in the burning city of Stalingrad, were diverted to the east bank. The arrival of the 37mm and 85mm flak guns gave the workers a morale boost. Now, when the Stukas dived, they were met with a curtain of tracers. The air above the construction site became a swirling dogfight. Soviet Yak and LaGG fighters engaged the German bombers over the heads of the track layers. The workers would pause, looking up to cheer as a smoking Heinkel plummeted into the earth, then immediately returned to swinging their mauls. The war was not happening near them. It was happening on top of them. The line advanced, not in miles per day, but in meters per hour. It was a halting, bloody progress. The railhead, the point where the track ended, was a scene of organized chaos. The construction train pushed the rails out in front of itself, moving forward onto the track it had just laid only minutes before. It was a precarious act of faith. The engine driver would inch the heavy locomotive onto the fresh, unsettled rails, the wood groaning under the weight, the ground shifting slightly. If the track held, they moved another 10 meters. If it sank, they reversed, jacked it up, packed more dirt, and tried again. They were literally building the bridge as they walked across it. By late August, the gap between the northern railhead coming from Saratov and the southern spur near Stalingrad was closing. The landscape behind them was a graveyard of destroyed equipment and fresh mounds of earth, but the steel ribbon remained unbroken. They had built through the heat, through the thirst, and through the fire. The Luftwaffe had thrown high explosives at them, and they had answered with shovels. The Germans had dominance of the air, but the Soviets were claiming the ground, sleeper by sleeper, securing the path for the deliverance of the city that was burning on the horizon. By late September 1942, the air over the Volga had turned crisp, signaling the approach of the Russian autumn. In the city of Stalingrad, the battle had devolved into a feral struggle for individual rooms and sewer pipes, with the Soviet defenders backed all the way to the river's edge. The German Sixth Army had technically won the tactical battle for the city. They occupied 90% of the urban area and had reached the Volga at multiple points. But strategy operates on a different timeline than tactics. While the German infantrymen were celebrating their incremental advances in the rubble, a far more significant event was taking place on the silent, empty steppe of the East Bank. On a nondescript patch of ground near the village of Ilovlya, the northern and southern construction columns of the Volga lateral finally met. There was no grand ceremony, no polished brass band, and no golden spike driven by a dignitary in a top hat. The golden spike of the Volzhskaya Rokada was a rusty iron nail salvaged from a dismantled depot in Siberia, hammered into a pine sleeper by a worker whose boots were held together with wire. The moment was marked not by speeches, but by the heavy metallic clank of the final fish plate being bolted shut. The two jagged ends of the line were fused. The circuit was complete. The engineers checked their watches and realized the magnitude of what the Army of Shadows had achieved. They had constructed nearly 1,000 kilometers of main line and station tracks in just under 100 days. In peacetime, such a feat would have taken 3 years. They had moved millions of cubic meters of earth and laid tens of thousands of tons of steel without a single automated track layer. It was a victory of logistics that rivaled any breakthrough on the battlefield, but the true test was yet to come. A continuous track meant nothing if it could not support the crushing weight of a fully loaded military transport. The order was given to test the line immediately. The first train was not a lightweight ceremonial carriage. It was a heavy freight convoy, a control train designed to stress the embankment to its breaking point. At the head of the convoy sat a massive FD-class steam locomotive, a beast of black iron known as Felix Dzerzhinsky. It was one of the most powerful engines in the Soviet fleet, heavy and unforgiving. Behind it stretched a long line of flat cars loaded with T-34 tanks fresh from the factories in the Urals, followed by boxcars packed to the roof with artillery shells. The driver, a veteran of the pre-war railways, climbed into the cab with a grim expression. He knew the risks. The roadbed was green. It hadn't had time to settle naturally. The soil was still shifting. If the embankment gave way under the locomotive's weight, the train would roll down the slope, taking the tanks and the crew with it. He released the brakes, and the steam pistons hissed. With a shuddering groan, the wheels began to turn. The train crept forward onto the new rails, moving at a walking pace. The engineers walked alongside the locomotive, their eyes glued to the tracks. They watched the rails flex and bow under the axle load. They watched the sleepers depress into the ballast and spring back up. Every creak of the wood sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. The train moved slowly, a dark snake winding through the cuts and over the temporary wooden trestle bridges that spanned the dry ravines. At the curves, the flanges of the wheels screamed against the mismatched rails, throwing sparks into the dry grass. But the gauge held. The frantic work of the blacksmiths and the welders had paid off. The Frankenstein Railway was holding together. As the train picked up speed, reaching a cautious 20 kilometers per hour, the mood shifted from terror to exhilaration. The locomotive's whistle blasted, a long, mournful shriek that rolled across the steppe. For the workers lining the tracks, that sound was the voice of victory. They stood up from their trenches, leaning on their shovels, watching the fruits of their suffering thunder past. This was no longer just a construction site. It was a functioning artery of the Soviet Union. The tanks on those flat cars were not just metal. They were salvation for the men trapped in the burning city to the west. The arrival of the first train at the railhead opposite Stalingrad was a moment of profound psychological impact. For weeks, the defenders on the West Bank had looked across the river and seen only the empty steppe, a reminder of their isolation. Now they saw plumes of smoke rising from the east. They heard the rhythmic chug of engines. The physical connection to the motherland had been restored. The psychological encirclement of Stalingrad was broken before the military encirclement was even attempted. The operational reality of the line, however, was far from smooth. It operated under a system known as the Green Street, or living block. Because there were few sidings, and signaling systems were primitive or non-existent, trains were often run in one direction only for set blocks of time. It was a high-stakes conveyor belt. Trains ran nose to tail, maintaining visual contact with the caboose of the train ahead. If the lead train stopped, the one behind it had to brake immediately or face a collision. At night, They drove without headlights to avoid the Luftwaffe, relying on the intuition of the crews and the faint glint of the rails under the moon. The capacity of the line stunned the German intelligence officers who had dismissed the construction effort. Within days of the Golden Spike, the Volga lateral was handling up to 22 pairs of trains per day. That meant dozens of convoys arriving every 24 hours, depositing thousands of tons of war material directly into the ferry crossings that fed the city. The German Sixth Army was expending its strength to choke the city, unaware that a fire hose of supplies had just been turned on behind the Soviet lines. The engineers did not have time to celebrate. As soon as the line was open, the maintenance war began. The heavy traffic pulverized the green tracks, rails snapped, sleepers cracked, and embankments subsided. The construction crews instantly morphed into repair brigades. They lived on the line, patching it between the passing of convoys, jacking up sinking sections while the dust of the previous train was still settling. It was a living organism that required constant attention to keep functioning. But the impossible had been achieved. The loop was closed. The resources of the vast Soviet interior, the coal of Kuzbass, the steel of Magnitogorsk, the oil of Baku, and the men of Siberia, could now flow uninterrupted to the banks of the Volga. The Germans believed they were fighting an isolated army in a ruined city. They did not realize they were now fighting the entire industrial output of the Soviet Union, delivered to their doorstep by a railway that wasn't supposed to exist. The completion of the Volzhskaya Rokada transformed the strategic equation of the Battle of Stalingrad almost overnight. What had been a starving garrison clinging to the ruins was suddenly connected to a high-speed logistical pump. The railway did not merely supply the city, it force-fed it. The German strategy of attrition, based on the assumption that the Soviets would run out of resources before the Wehrmacht ran out of offensive power, was rendered obsolete by the sheer volume of tonnage now arriving at the railheads on the East Bank. The scenes at the unloading stations, particularly at the terminals of Peromnaya and Aktuba, were apocalyptic in their intensity. Under the cover of darkness, the Green Street system delivered train after train in a relentless rhythm. The doors of the boxcars slid open to reveal the Soviet Union's answer to the German panzers. Not just machines, but men. Entire divisions, fresh from the reserves in Siberia and the Far East, poured out onto the steppe. These were not the battered, retreating remnants of the summer disasters. These were well-equipped, well-fed units, clad in winter gear, their morale high, their weapons brand new. General Rodimtsev's 13th Guards Rifle Division, whose arrival would famously save the city in mid-September, traveled down this very line. The soldiers disembarked from the trains into the cool night air, the smell of cordite and burning oil drifting across the river to greet them. They marched directly from the rail platforms to the waiting barges on the riverbank. The railway acted as a funnel, channeling tens of thousands of reinforcements into the narrow crossing points. Without the rail line to bring them to the river's edge, these troops would have been forced to march hundreds of kilometers across the open steppe, arriving exhausted and piecemeal. Instead, they arrived as a cohesive sledgehammer, ready to be thrown into the furnace. But the trains carried more than just flesh. They brought the iron diet that modern warfare demanded. The voracious artillery batteries on the east bank, which fired over the river to support the defenders in the city, required mountains of shells. A single barrage could expend hundreds of tons of ammunition in minutes. Before the railway, these guns had to ration their fire. Now, with the heavy freight trains rolling in daily, the Soviet artillery commanders could unleash a wall of fire at will. The trains brought crates of 76mm shells, heavy 152mm howitzer rounds, and the terrifying rockets for the Katyusha launchers. The logistical chain was seamless. A shell, manufactured in a factory in the Urals, could be loaded onto a train, transported down the Volzhskaya Rokada, offloaded onto a truck, ferried across the river, and fired at a German tank in the tractor factory district, all within a matter of days. The railway compressed the geography of the war, bringing the industrial rear right up to the front line. While the southbound trains carried the fuel for the war, the northbound trains, the ones heading back towards Saratov and the interior, carried the wreckage. The sanitary trains became a common sight on the line. These were not the luxury hospital trains of peacetime, but converted freight convoys. Boxcars were lined with straw and fitted with wooden bunks, stacked 3 high. Into these rolling ambulances, the medics loaded the human cost of the battle. Thousands of wounded soldiers, evacuated from the cellars and ruins of Stalingrad under fire, were ferried across the river and lifted onto the trains. For many, the vibration of the wheels on the rails was the first sensation of safety they had felt in weeks. The railway saved countless lives simply by speed. Before the line was built, the wounded often languished in field hospitals on the steppe, dying of infection or exposure while waiting for slow motor transport. Now, a soldier wounded in the morning could be on a train by evening and in a specialized hospital in Saratov by the next day. The line also facilitated the evacuation of the city's industrial soul. While the battle raged, workers were still dismantling key machinery from the factories in the northern districts of Stalingrad. Valuable turbines, precision lathes, and generators were dragged to the river, floated across, and loaded onto the flat cars of the Volzhskaya Rokada. The railway allowed the Soviets to salvage their future even as they fought for their present. Additionally, thousands of civilians, women, children, and the elderly who had been trapped in the war zone were packed into the empty supply trains returning north. The railway was a loop of salvation and destruction, pumping life into the battle and draining death out of it. The operational tempo was grueling. The station masters worked without sleep, juggling the schedules of incoming troop trains and outgoing hospital convoys. The living block system was pushed to its absolute limit. There were moments of terrifying congestion where trains were backed up for miles, sitting ducks for the Luftwaffe. Yet the German air attacks, while still dangerous, were becoming less effective. The sheer redundancy of the system was overwhelming. If a bomb destroyed a section of track, the repair crews, who were now permanently stationed along the line, fixed it in hours. The flow was interrupted, but never stopped. The railway also began to stockpile the strategic reserves necessary for the future counteroffensive. While the Germans were fixated on the street fighting in Stalingrad, taking heavy casualties for every meter of ground, the Soviet High Command was using the railway to quietly build up a massive armored fist on the flanks. Tanks that would later encircle the Sixth Army were not driven to their assembly areas. They were carried there by the Volzhskaya Rokada. The railway allowed the Soviets to play a shell game, moving vast forces laterally behind the front, invisible to the German commanders who were looking only at the city. The meat grinder of Stalingrad was hungry, and the railway was the chef that kept it fed. It turned the battle from a siege into a war of attrition that Germany could not win. The German supply lines, stretching back thousands of kilometers on overstretched, partisan-plagued tracks, were fraying. The Soviet supply line, thanks to the new railway, was robust, short, and efficient. The dynamic of the battle had shifted fundamentally. The Germans were fighting at the end of a long, dying tether, while the Soviets were fighting with the full weight of their industrial might right behind them. The railway had converted the barren steppe into a dynamo of war, and the hum of the tracks was the sound of the German defeat approaching. By November 1942, the Russian steppe had undergone its seasonal transformation. The scorching heat and blinding dust of summer were replaced by the biting winds and heavy snows of early winter. The ground, once loose and treacherous for the track layers, was now frozen solid. For the German Sixth Army, huddled in the ruins of Stalingrad, the winter brought misery. Their supply lines, already stretched to the breaking point, began to collapse entirely under the weight of the snow and the partisan attacks on the rail lines far to the west. They were an army running on fumes, eating horse meat and shivering in summer uniforms. But on the east bank of the Volga, the Volzhskaya Rokada was humming with a terrifying vitality. The Frankenstein Railway had spent the autumn months doing more than just keeping the defenders alive. It had been silently preparing their vengeance. While the Germans had focused their entire gaze on the street fighting within the city, obsessing over capturing a single factory hall or a specific apartment block, the Soviet High Command had used the railway to execute a strategic sleight of hand. The railway allowed the Soviets to secretly mass an overwhelming force on the flanks of the German salient. Operation Uranus, the great counter-offensive designed to encircle the Sixth Army, was entirely dependent on the logistical capacity of this single line. For weeks, under the cover of the long winter nights, the trains had delivered the components of a catastrophe. They brought the 5th Tank Army to the north and the Heavy Mechanized Corps to the south. They offloaded millions of artillery shells into camouflaged dumps that stretched for miles along the tracks. This was the logistical supremacy that the desperate decree had promised. The Germans assumed the Soviets were exhausted, lacking the reserves to launch a major attack. They calculated this based on the capacity of the known road networks and the frozen river. They did not factor in the railway that wasn't on their maps. They did not account for the phantom trains that had moved an entire front's worth of men and material into position right under their noses. On the morning of November 19, 1942, the bill came due. At 7:20 a.m., the order was given. The silence of the steppe was shattered by the roar of 3,500 artillery pieces and mortars opening fire simultaneously. The sky turned purple with the trails of Katyusha rockets. The bombardment was so intense that the German meteorological units registered it as a seismic event. Every single shell that screamed overhead, tearing into the Romanian and German lines, had traveled on the rails laid by the Army of Shadows. The Soviet armored pincers smashed through the weak flanks of the Axis lines. The T-34s, fueled by diesel brought in from Saratov on the Volzhskaya Rokada, raced across the snow-covered steppe. They moved with a speed and endurance that the fuel-starved German panzers could not match. The logistical tether held. As the tanks advanced, the railway continued to pump supplies forward, ensuring the offensive did not stall for lack of ammunition. The Green Street became a conveyor belt of victory. 4 days later, on November 23rd, the two Soviet pincers met at the town of Kalach-na-Donu, west of Stalingrad. The trap snapped shut. The German Sixth Army, nearly 300,000 men, the conquerors of Europe, was completely encircled. They were cut off from their supplies, their hospitals, and their high command. The besiegers had become the besieged. The irony was absolute. The Germans had spent months trying to cut the Soviet supply lines to the city, only to find themselves strangled by a Soviet supply ring that had been built behind the safety of the river. The Volzhskaya Rokada had facilitated one of the greatest military reversals in history. It had turned the Volga from a barrier into a springboard. In the months that followed, as the pocket was slowly crushed, the railway continued to serve its purpose. It brought the reinforcements that tightened the noose and evacuated the prisoners who surrendered. The railway of life for the Soviets became the railway of death for the Sixth Army. When the guns finally fell silent in February 1943 and Field Marshal Paulus emerged from his basement headquarters to surrender, the landscape of the war had changed forever. The myth of German invincibility was broken in the ruins of Stalingrad, but the victory was not just won by the sniper in the window or the tanker in the T-34. It was won by the prisoner who swung a pickaxe in the July heat, the teenage girl who carried rocks in a wicker basket, and the engineer who dared to build a railway without a blueprint. The steel ribbon on the East Bank stood as silent proof that in total war, the shovel is as deadly as the rifle. The Volzhskaya Rokada was more than just a logistical feat. It was the spine of the Soviet survival instinct. Built in 100 days by a workforce of women, prisoners, and peasants, it defied every rule of civil engineering and military doctrine. It proved that while battles are fought with courage, wars are won with capacity. The 1,000 kilometers of scavenged steel and hand-packed earth did what the entire Wehrmacht could not. It dictated the tempo of history. Today, parts of the line still exist, integrated into the vast Russian rail network, ferrying grain and passengers across the quiet steppe. The scars of the bomb craters have long since healed over with grass. But for those who know where to look, the old embankments remain a monument to the army of shadows. They remind us that the turning point of World War II was not just a moment of tactical brilliance, but a triumph of industrial will. The German Sixth Army died at Stalingrad not because they lacked fire, but because they faced a nation that could build a river of steel out of nothing and ride it to victory. And that is why these tales must be told.